Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
Counting down to the Fed and the meeting of the minds. Welcome to the Wednesday edition as we approach the Fed's announcement on interest rates just an hour away. And President Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping. That'll take place tonight, East Coast time. This hour, we're going to get an update from South Korea live as the president makes his way through the APEC summit. And we'll spend some time with Republican Senator Shelley Capito of West Virginia on this day 29 of the government shutdown. Our political panel is in place, and by the time this hour is out, we'll have special coverage on this Fed Day in Washington. Let's start right now with a look at Wall Street. Charlie Pellet has the latest on the Wednesday trade as we get set for an interest rate cut. At least that's what the market's looking for. Charlie, how does the market look?
Absolutely right about that, Joe Mathieu. 1 hour from now, when it all comes down, we got you covered here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Our Michael McKee standing by in Washington for that Fed decision as it drops. And of course, Jay Powell's news conference. We got you covered on that too, live, 2:30 p.m. Wall Street time. Equities higher across the board right now with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, yes, Russell 2000 index, all solidly advancing. Right to the numbers, S&P up 18 now, 69.09. Will we hold above that number today with a close there? Right now, the S&P up 0.3%. The Dow up 267. That is a gain of 0.6%. NASDAQ up 137 right now. The NASDAQ Composite Index up by about 0.6%. Our Mag 7 Index higher now by 0.6%. With a 10-year at 3.99%, the 2-year 3.50%, the 30-year 4.56%. Spot gold at $39.93 the ounce, up 1% today, higher by $41. Silver up 2.2%, $48.10 for an ounce of silver, and crude now at $60.62 a barrel. WTI up by about 0.8%. Nvidia making corporate and market history today with a $5 trillion market cap as CEO Jensen Huang's spree of deals catapults the AI intelligence frenzy to new heights. And by the way, it's only been 4 months since the company cracked the $4 trillion barrier. Coming up after the close of trading, a ton of very important earnings. We'll be hearing from Alphabet, Microsoft and Meta Platforms, and of course, Amazon and Apple follow tomorrow. Recapping S&P right now up 0.2%. And for on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host is Joe Mathieu.
All right, Charlie, we thank you. Charlie Pellet live from New York. He'll have more in just about 15 minutes as we follow the beat here on the markets, working our way up to the Fed's announcement on interest rates just under an hour from now. Our special coverage here on Bloomberg TV and Radio will begin at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, just about a half hour away, as you would expect on a Fed day in Washington. Michael McKee has just made his way over to the Federal Reserve, and of course, he'll be asking questions of Chair Jay Powell once the news conference begins at 2:30. So you know the cycle here. We're going to witness this all together in real time on Bloomberg with a Federal Reserve that is dealing with a major lack of data right now because of a government shutdown that is now 29 days old. This is what we're going to be talking about with the senator from West Virginia in just a moment. Shelley Capito is with us, knowing that the House is out of session, the president's out of the country, and the latest voting in the Senate yesterday, number 13, lucky 13, the same as the first 12. The clean continuing resolution that Republicans passed in the House failed again. There is talk about rank and file talks getting under backroom conversations, but we've been hearing that for weeks. And the fact of the matter is there is no off-ramp still today. So it won't take that much more to set a new record. The record is 35 days in the first Trump administration. Then again, that was a partial shutdown. This is already a record full shutdown. And there's going to be an attempt to vote on some legislation. There's a Democratic version, actually a couple of Democratic versions, and then there's the Josh Hawley version to fulfill SNAP benefits for the month of October. On the first, this is food stamps. We talk about SNAP. Food stamps will not be funded any longer, and many thought this would be an inflection point to potentially break the logjam. It doesn't sound like it, as Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, was discussing earlier on the floor. Listen.
The bill is simple, it's moral, it's urgent, and ask John Thune why he won't put it on the floor. He decries the fact that SNAP benefits are cut off. He knows the money is available. He knows there's broad Republican support for it, and he doesn't put it on the floor. He's afraid of Trump.
So this doesn't sound like it's getting any better. And it's where we start our conversation, as I mentioned, with Republican Senator Shelley Capito of West Virginia. She's live on Capitol Hill. And Senator, it's great to see you on Bloomberg TV and radio. Our listeners should know, and we discussed this, J.D. Vance made a visit to Capitol Hill, and it was upon your invitation as chair of the Republican Policy Committee. What was the idea of having the vice president join the conversation, and was it productive? Did he bring new ideas or hear ideas from you and your colleagues?
Well, it's always productive to have the vice president. He's such a great leader, and he obviously knows everybody, all the Republican senators, because he was one just a short time ago. And so we have a great personal relationship with him. He came on the heels of his visit, obviously, to Israel, but he wanted to reemphasize that opening the government is the most sensible, easiest, sanest way to begin these negotiations after we open the government. So he's very supportive of the position that many of us have taken, and I think he feels as strongly about it as we do. He also talked about tariffs. He reassured us that the president is moving forward in a very measured way to make sure the American worker is getting the advantages from tariffs, and the deals that he's been solidifying on his Asian trip with Malaysia and Cambodia and others are going to really enhance American manufacturing. And then he talked a lot about chips and the situation with China and special metals and all of these things. So it was a comprehensive visit, but I think it really reinforced to me anyway that we have ourselves set on a path, this country on a path to really bring more prosperity to the American worker, and that's a very uniting principle for us.
I don't know if you got into the idea of SNAP benefits expiring, Senator, but you might have heard me refer to some of the legislation that has been put forth with 3 days here until assistance programs run out of money. What do you think of Senator Josh Hawley's idea here to fund SNAP? I know there's a separate version in the House that Representative Bresnahan is working on to fund the WIC program. Should we be entertaining these ideas? Or does that create a scenario in which you're picking favorites? Some people are getting paid, others are not. Some programs are being funded, others are not, when we should simply be focused on reopening the government?
Well, I mean, the simple answer here is if you reopen the government, all of these issues go away. SNAP benefits, air traffic controllers, military, government services, et cetera. And so now that we're into 29 days, it is really beginning to wear on the American people. So you take my state of West Virginia, 18% of our households have a SNAP benefit. I think about the young mother who has a single mother with children. That's a frightening prospect to think that she wouldn't have the money to feed her children, or a disabled or elderly couple. And so these are real human problems that honestly, Chuck Schumer can pontificate on the floor about how it's John Thune's fault. I don't think the American people care whose fault it is. Reopening the government is the simplest, easiest way to proceed. We do have an agriculture bill out there that does have SNAP benefits in the appropriations bill. We could look at that as a possible vehicle. I am on Josh Hawley's bill because of the heavy impacts, almost, like I said, almost 20% of my state. It's a heavy impact to my state. And if his bill were to come to the floor, I would be, I'm a co-sponsor now, and I would also be in favor of voting for it.
That's great to know. Do you know if it would pass? Do you have the votes if it gets to the floor?
You know, I would suspect I believe there's probably at least 10 and probably more co-sponsors to that bill, which would give you the 60-vote margin to move forward. But we have to keep going back to the political nature of this shutdown, and also the easiest, simplest way is to do what we've done, what I did 13 times when President Biden was the president, just vote to reopen the government to a continuing resolution while we debate the issues of health care premiums and other issues that want to be debated.
Well, you know, you've been hearing this, I'm sure. If I'm hearing it, you're hearing it, Senator. The idea of a full-year continuing resolution. The head of Ways and Means in the House, Jason Smith, told us he was behind that idea. We know the White House has floated it. John Thune at one point said, hey, this might be the way out of shutdowns for the next year. But I know there are a lot of concerns among appropriators, and maybe you share their concerns that this is still a Joe Biden budget.
Right.
Would you vote for a year-long CR?
I'm going to leave that to see if that's an option. I don't know where we would be to have to make that vote, but I'm an appropriator myself. I'm the chairman of the Health, Education, and Labor Subcommittee, enormous appropriating for the year. I want to have President Trump's priorities in the appropriations process. I want to have my priorities in the appropriations process. I don't want to cede that to just simply what I think is sort of mindless spending in a continuing resolution here for forever for a 13-month period of time. So I would rather see us go to the appropriations process on the floor, like Senator Thune has brought to the floor, which, by the way, Senator Schumer never did the year before, and so we can actually do the bipartisan work that we do so well on appropriations. That's the preferred route. If we can get 7 or 8 of these bills over the threshold, and you may be rolling your eyes thinking, how could they possibly do that when they can't keep the government open? I'm an optimist. I think we can. We've worked on these bills before, and they're exceedingly important to make sure that President Trump gets the priorities that he has and that we share with him into the appropriating cycle.
You're on half the committees in the Senate, of course. That includes Commerce, and I'm wondering your thoughts about what's going to happen with the FAA here, Senator. The TSA, I realize, is a slightly different matter here, but everybody is working it from the air traffic control tower down to the security checkpoint in the airport. They're all working without pay right now, and at some point, based on what we're hearing from workers who are at 60 hours a week, they might have to look for other work. The unions might decide to start doing sick-outs or walkouts. If we start seeing massive cancellations and delays, and I know we're already getting a taste with some of the ground stops that have been happening around the country, is that what shakes loose a couple of Democrats to sign on to this CR? Or do you see it differently?
No, I don't see it differently. I do think that is definitely a pressure point when you see the thousands of delays. And you also realize at what point is safety imperiled here, and that is the greater question. But, we're asking people, or a shutdown asks people to skip not just one paycheck. Now we're into 2 paychecks. These are families. Yeah. These are people that have obligations, that have it is such a disservice to not just the air traffic controllers, but to every single federal employee, which in my state are quite a few. And not to mention the troops, the Coast Guard, the TSA agents, all of these folks. And so simply open the government, get the money flowing to those that are working and have worked, and provide the services, and let's get on to negotiation. Let's drop the politics of a shutdown. I don't think it's working for Senator Schumer, and I think I could hear a little desperation in his voice there when you played his clip. I think he's looking for a way out, and we have an easy way to do it with the bipartisan talks that we've had over premiums and other issues that we all share concerns about.
Yeah. Definitely had a frog in his throat, Senator. I want to ask you before you leave us about tariffs, because there was an important vote yesterday that really raised a lot of eyebrows, a vote to eliminate the 50% tariff on Brazil. And it was a 52-48 vote. It came with the support of a group I was referring to earlier as the Feisty Five. Your Republican colleagues, Susan Collins, Mitch McConnell, Lisa Murkowski, Rand Paul, and Thom Tillis. Should we assume that because it is those 5, that this is not some sort of groundswell to check the president in the Senate? Or is this, in fact, the line that has been drawn by Republicans when it comes to trade?
Well, I think you see a variety of opinions. We have a lot of free traders within the Republican conference. We have a lot of folks whose industries over years, and I would put myself in this position, have been exceedingly disadvantaged by the unfair trade practices with Canada, but also, China and other places where our manufacturing, we've lost jobs, and in some cases our products are very much at a disadvantage. And I'm glad that President Trump's going to work for the American worker through tariffs. But here's what I would say to him if he was sitting right here in front of me. This needs to be settled, and it needs to be settled now. We can't, the ebbs and flows and uncertainty that we have in some cases, I think, does provide a lot of capital staying on the sidelines, lack of investment, and people are not able to move forward. So I think certainty, and that means set the policies, set the reciprocal trade policies that are fair and that help our American worker, and let's move from there. And I think we'll satisfy both goals, both the worker goal, but also the goal of the president for us to not be in a disadvantaged situation.
Really interesting and great to talk to you, Senator Shelley Capito of West Virginia. We appreciate the conversation with us live from Capitol Hill. See, we've had two lawmakers here who are in Washington, even though, well, the House is out of session. The Senate is still at it, having now voted 13 times. Now, we just spoke quite a bit about President Trump and the meeting tomorrow. If you're on the East Coast right now, it's tonight, actually, because of our time difference with South Korea. President Trump will be sitting down with President Xi at roughly 10 p.m. Eastern time tonight. And yes, the stakes are very high following his time in South Korea, in which another framework trade agreement was codified into an actual trade deal. Joining us from South Korea right now, she's in fact in Gwangju, where President Trump is going to be meeting tomorrow with President Xi. Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg's Washington correspondent, joins us now from the other side of the world ahead of this meeting. Tyler, I believe it's about 2 o'clock in the morning where you are. What kind of preparations are going into this meeting tomorrow, and what will be the venue?
Yeah, hey, Joe. So we have confirmation on the city. It's going to be in Busan, about an hour north from where I currently am. There's speculation on the venue right now. We can't publicly confirm it, but we are expecting this bilateral meeting to happen. We'll see if press gets invited in or if President Trump gives any sort of remarks afterward. That's something that we're keenly watching for. As you well know, at the White House, these bilateral meetings often open up. But considering just how high the stakes are, we're waiting to see if that's the case here, too. Now, you laid it out before. There's really just so much on the table right now that we just don't know when it comes to what these two leaders are actually going to agree to. But what has been clear is that there's been a simmering of tensions in recent days. But I have to say, from following President Trump these last few days here in Asia, it really does feel like the White House is trying to gain as much leverage as possible, no matter going in to this high stakes meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Look at the agreements signed in Tokyo yesterday on critical minerals, on shipbuildings, these pledged investments in these areas that the U.S. has deemed absolutely essential when it comes to countering China. And then today, as you mentioned, inking this long-awaited trade deal with South Korea. Now, Joe, this was highly anticipated. The president had telegraphed earlier that this was going to happen this week, but it came after a lot of months of negotiating, some last-minute negotiating and pomp and circumstance here on the ground in South Korea. But we can officially say that they now have that 15% tariff in place, and that also extends to autos. That is absolutely critical, as you well know, so that South Korea's market can compete with their neighbor Japan's market, which brings us back to kind of closes the loop on this whole trip, because they want to stay competitive in this region, particularly when it comes to car making and autos.
Well, we're lucky to have you there, Tyler. Of course, Tyler will have much more coverage for us throughout the course of this meeting that, again, will start 10 p.m. Eastern time, 10 p.m. tonight. It'll be already Thursday in South Korea. After the meeting with the South Korean president, President Lee gave President Trump a crown. Did you see that? The crown that symbolizes the divine connection, they said, between the authority of the heavens, sovereignty on earth, as well as the strong leadership and authority of a leader. President Lee, wearing a gold tie, also presented President Trump with a medal, the Grand Order of the Mugagungwa, South Korea's highest civil honor. They had a great lunch, seafood salad tossed with Thousand Island dressing and a brownie that included a gold decoration on the front of it. What will tomorrow's meeting bring? We'll find out together here on Bloomberg. The market's in a great mood despite the government now being closed for 29 days, as we discussed with Senator Shelley Capito, and despite the uncertainty surrounding what I'll call tonight's meeting between President Trump and President Xi. That's going to happen at 10 p.m. Eastern time. They're in South Korea. And so the market's going to be waking up to headlines from that meeting only hours after hearing from the Federal Reserve Chair. So we've got a lot of balls in the air here, and we want to spend some time with our panel as we head for our special coverage. Bloomberg politics contributor Jeanne Zaino is with us, democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, and Republican strategist Ashley Davis is here, partner at the S3 Group, former special assistant to the director of Homeland Security. Wonderful to have you both here. As we walk up to our special coverage, Jeanne, I wonder your thoughts on this job that Jay Powell has today. We discussed it earlier with Michael McKee. The market clearly anticipates it's a very anticlimactic decision on rates. But what is he going to say in the news conference when there's such a dearth of data because of the government shutdown? We didn't even see the last jobs report, Jeanne. How can he answer Michael McKee today?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating because he doesn't have the data to go on. And of course, Jay Powell always says they are making these decisions based on the data. So Michael's going to have a lot to ask him. I don't know if he'll have some answers. And, you know, for Jerome Powell, what we're looking at is, I really think, a tale of two very different worlds. You just mentioned the stock market booming, liking what they see despite this uncertainty. And yet you look at the polls of the American public and they have a dismal view of the economy. And I'm not sure how somebody like Jerome Powell threads that needle. You know, he is not the one that's unpopular in terms of the economy necessarily. That's Donald Trump, the lowest approval ratings of any president in the second term on the economy since they started polling and tracking this in 1977. So they are pretty dismal numbers, despite what Donald Trump likes to say, and despite the numbers we're seeing on the stock market.
I want to mention just a quick breaking story that just crossed our terminal. Alaska Air says disruptions have been caused to key systems, currently experiencing a disruption caused by Microsoft's Azure outage. This is bad timing for Microsoft, which is preparing to deliver its earnings report. And shares of Mr. Softy are now down about 0.5%. Shares of Alaska Air are down almost 2%. We're not sure what's going to come from this, but we will keep our eyes on this for you. Ashley, I don't know how we describe the state of this economy going into this Fed decision when, A, we have unresolved tariffs, we have a government shutdown that's impacting an already weakening job market. Jay Powell's got his work cut out for him, doesn't he?
Absolutely, but this is like the worst kept secret, right? It's like anticlimactic. Is there going to be another quarter in the beginning, you know, of next year as well? And I think it's been talked about so much that the market's
anticlimactic.
Exactly.
But
and
what
also
does he say in the news conference? Because he'll be asked about tariffs, and this meeting hasn't happened yet.
No, well, the China meeting hasn't either. But I don't think, listen, what I'm watching today, number one, is what the vote's going to be. Because I don't think it's going to be unanimous. Do you?
Which vote? In terms of the Fed, you're saying, not the Senate vote on the CR.
No.
What do I know? But if that's the case, are you talking about somebody other than Stephen Myron?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I don't think anyone doesn't think that it needs to happen, but I think there's going to maybe be some political statements at the Fed today with their vote. But I mean, listen, the whole thing is very difficult because, and it was exactly right when Jeanne said the American people are still paying more for their groceries, especially. I mean, and that's what's really impacting the everyday American. Obviously, gas prices are down. The stock markets are way up, like out of control up. No one even listens to tariffs anymore, like the tariff conversation anywhere. China was the only one that's been moving the markets a little bit, but
we're assuming that that's going to be solved.
It's going to be fine, yeah. So I think listen, I will never say that Donald Trump hasn't done so much these first 10 months that he's been in office, good or bad. He's done more than probably anyone we have in our lifetime. However, if he doesn't get our day-to-day lives under control in regards to just everyday prices, that's what's going to hurt him, and that's what's going to hurt the midterms. I mean, again, like what we were talking about last hour, he's not going to be he's not running again for re-election, but he has a huge tailwind.
So then the job, interesting, becomes a more difficult one for Jay Powell in this case, Jeanne, and the president's calling him out every chance that he can get. What will be the narrative that comes from the Fed chair today, if nothing more than ask me when the data are released? As I mentioned, we haven't even seen the most recent BLS jobs data, the most recent monthly report. So technically, other than a CPI report and a beige book, I think Jay Powell doesn't know anything he knew at the last meeting.
That's right. And how much more could he add without that data? It is simply, not consistent with the way he has comported himself. I can't imagine he would step out in advance of any data coming. So I think we're going to hear a lot of, we will have to wait and see, or, we can't answer that until we get this data. And I think it's so important to think about, as we look at what's happening in China tomorrow, we think about the uncertainty that the tariffs have brought. The American public is looking at this tariff regime, and they are not happy with what they are seeing. We've talked about the soybean farmers. As much as Donald Trump says that he has beat inflation, the American public isn't feeling that. To Ashley's point, you even had Fed member Stephen Marin come out and say the stunting of the job hirings is a result of uncertainty over tariffs. And so all of that in combination, the irony is Donald Trump likes to blame Jerome Powell and kick him around a bit, but this is really on Donald Trump's lap and in his hands. And where is he? He's overseas doing this deal, but the American public want him here addressing what he was elected to do, which is to make their lives more affordable. And that has not happened.
In our remaining moment or so, Ashley, we see wage gains cooling to some of the lowest levels in more than a decade, according to the J.P. Morgan Chase Institute. Younger American workers bearing the brunt of the slowdown. You mentioned prices. When you combine that with wages, how do they collide for the midterms?
I mean, listen, we have to wait and see, but I do think that the wages are going through a correction. Obviously not in some sectors. If you are in the AI sector, you're getting paid.
Doing pretty well.
You're doing very well, and you're being sought after by many different companies. But yeah, I do think there's a course correction here. But also, what I'm watching is some of the DOGE impacts that have happened. Listen, have always said, Joe, that federal government was too big. Whether you agree how it was handled or not through the DOGE stuff, that's one thing.
Yeah.
However, what's happening right now is through DOGE and the government cutting back is you see some of these major consultancies, EY, Accenture, really letting off a lot of their people because there isn't that money just flying out the door from
Even
the federal
some
government.
of the Mag 7 been laying off, if you look at what we saw from Amazon.
With Amazon.
Ashley Davis, Jeanne, Zaino, many thanks to both of you for a great panel, a special edition of Bloomberg Surveillance, The Fed Decides.